In the annals of Roman imperial history, where cruelty and excess were commonplace, few stories descend into such depths of perversion and madness as the twisted tale of Emperor Caligula and his beloved sister, Julia Drusilla. This is not merely a chronicle of political intrigue or military conquest. This is a harrowing exploration of how absolute power can corrupt the most fundamental bonds of human nature, transforming sibling love into something so dark and consuming that it would shake the very foundations of the Roman Empire. It was 37 AD when Gaius Julius Caesar Augustus Germanicus, known to history as Caligula, ascended to the imperial throne. The Roman Empire stretched from the windswept moors of Britain to the sun-scorched deserts of Egypt, and the citizens of Rome rejoiced at the prospect of a young, charismatic emperor who promised to heal the wounds left by his predecessor, Tiberius. Little did they know that behind the charming smile and popular reforms lurked a mind that would soon spiral into realms of madness that would horrify even the most jaded Romans. At the heart of this imperial darkness stood Julia Drusilla, Caligula's sister, whose beauty and intelligence had captivated not only the Roman court, but most dangerously, the emperor himself. Born into the Julio-Claudian dynasty, Drusilla possessed an otherworldly grace that made her the envy of noble women throughout the empire. Her raven black hair, porcelain skin, and piercing eyes seemed to embody the very essence of Roman nobility. But in the halls of imperial power, such beauty could become a curse, and for Drusilla it would become the source of her ultimate tragedy. The whispers began almost immediately after Caligula's coronation. Palace servants spoke in hushed tones of the emperor's unusual devotion to his sister, how his eyes would follow her every movement, how he would seek her counsel above all others. These were not the normal bonds of sibling affection. There was something else, something darker and more consuming that seemed to possess the young emperor whenever Drusilla entered his presence. As months passed, the rumors grew more disturbing. Courtiers reported seeing Caligula and Drusilla together in private chambers at all hours, their interactions marked by an intimacy that transcended the boundaries of familial love. The emperor would lavish upon his sister gifts of unprecedented extravagance, jewels that had once adorned Egyptian queens, silks from the far reaches of the empire, and golden ornaments crafted by the finest artisans in Rome. But these material tokens were nothing compared to the political power Caligula began to bestow upon Drusilla. In an unprecedented move, he elevated her to a position of influence that no Roman woman had ever held. The emperor's obsession with Drusilla manifested in increasingly disturbing ways. He would insist that she accompany him to all public events, not as a sibling, but as something approaching a co-ruler. Ancient historians, writing with the caution necessary when documenting imperial scandals, nevertheless recorded accounts that left little doubt about the nature of the relationship between Caligula and Drusilla. Suetonius, in his Chronicles of the 12 Caesars, wrote with barely concealed disgust of the emperor's shameless intimacy with his sister, describing how Caligula would publicly declare his love for Drusilla in terms that shocked even the most libertine members of Roman society. What began as an unhealthy obsession soon transformed into something far more sinister. Caligula's love for Drusilla became a consuming fire that burned away his remaining connections to reality and moral restraint. He began to speak of her not merely as his beloved sister, but as his equal, his partner in ruling the empire, his other half in ways that violated every sacred tradition of Roman civilization. The emperor's behavior became increasingly erratic as his fixation on Drusilla deepened. He would fly into violent rages if anyone dared to question his sister's elevated status, executing senators and nobles who showed even the slightest disrespect toward her. The Roman legal system, which had functioned for centuries on established precedents and traditions, was twisted and perverted to accommodate Caligula's desire to legitimize his relationship with Drusilla. In a move that stunned the empire, Caligula began to refer to Drusilla as his wife in all but name. He commissioned portraits of them together that depicted them not as siblings, but as imperial consorts, their poses and expressions conveying an intimacy that scandalized Roman society. These images were distributed throughout the empire, forcing citizens from Britain to Egypt to confront the reality of their emperor's descent into madness. The psychological dynamics of their relationship were as complex as they were disturbing. Drusilla, trapped within the golden cage of imperial favor, found herself simultaneously elevated to unprecedented heights of power and imprisoned by her brother's obsessive love. Historical accounts suggest that she was not merely a passive victim, but an active participant in the relationship, whether by choice or by the inexorable pressure of imperial will. As Caligula's relationship with Drusilla became increasingly public and shameless, the Roman Empire found itself in the grip of a collective horror that few dared to voice. The Senate, once the proud voice of Roman republicanism, sat in stunned silence as the boundaries of acceptable behavior were not merely crossed but obliterated entirely. Foreign ambassadors returned to their kingdoms with tales so shocking that many refused to believe them. The emperor's madness extended beyond his relationship with Drusilla to encompass his entire worldview. He began to see himself as a godlike figure, with Drusilla as his divine consort. Together they would rule not merely as mortals but as deities, their love transcending the petty moral constraints that governed ordinary human relationships. This delusion of divine status would prove to be the foundation for the even greater madness that was to come. Their private conversations, as reported by terrified servants, were filled with grandiose plans for reshaping the Roman Empire according to their shared vision of absolute power and unlimited indulgence. The impact on Roman society was profound and lasting. Citizens found themselves living under a regime where the most fundamental moral boundaries, those between family members, between ruler and subject, between human and divine, had been completely erased. The empire that had once prided itself on its laws and traditions now existed at the whim of a madman and his beloved sister. Then in 38 AD, barely a year after Caligula's rise to power, tragedy struck with the force of a thunderbolt. Julia Drusilla, the object of the emperor's obsessive love, fell gravely ill. The exact nature of her illness remains shrouded in mystery. Some accounts suggest a fever, others point to more sinister possibilities, including poison administered by political enemies who sought to break Caligula's hold on power by destroying what he loved most. As Drusilla lay dying, Caligula's behavior became increasingly frantic and desperate. He summoned the greatest physicians in the empire, offering them unimaginable rewards for her recovery and threatening them with horrific deaths if they failed. The emperor, who had presented himself as a godlike figure, was reduced to a man frantically trying to save the one person who gave his existence meaning. The imperial palace became a house of mourning even before Drusilla's death, as Caligula refused to leave her bedside. Reports from the time described the emperor as a broken man, weeping openly, refusing to eat, and speaking to his dying sister in tones of such desperate tenderness that even his hardened guards were moved to tears. When Drusilla finally succumbed to her illness, the sound of Caligula's anguish reportedly echoed through the marble halls of the palace, an inhuman wail of grief that chilled the blood of all who heard it. The emperor, who had terrorized the Senate and intimidated foreign kings, was reduced to a sobbing, broken figure, cradling the lifeless body of his beloved sister. What followed Drusilla's death was a descent into madness so complete and terrifying that it would define the remainder of Caligula's reign and cement his reputation as one of history's most deranged rulers. Unable to accept the reality of his sister's death, the emperor began to construct an elaborate fantasy that would allow him to maintain his connection to her even beyond the grave. In an unprecedented act that shocked even the most cynical Romans, Caligula declared Drusilla to be a goddess. This was not merely a symbolic gesture or a traditional deification reserved for deceased emperors. This was a complete reconstruction of reality according to the emperor's grief-stricken delusions. He ordered temples to be built in her honor, established a cult of worship around her memory, and appointed priests to serve her divine spirit. The emperor's behavior became increasingly bizarre as he attempted to maintain his relationship with the deceased Drusilla. He would speak to her as if she were still alive, setting places for her at imperial banquets, consulting with her on matters of state, and even claiming to receive divine guidance from her spirit. Courtiers who failed to show proper reverence to Drusilla's memory faced execution, while those who participated in her cult worship were rewarded with positions of power and influence. Caligula began to present himself as a widower, adopting the dress and mannerisms of a grieving spouse rather than a mourning brother. He wore black clothing, refused to participate in public celebrations, and spoke constantly of his desire to join Drusilla in the afterlife. This public display of grief would have been shocking enough if it had been for a deceased wife, but for a sister, it represented a complete break with Roman tradition and moral order. The emperor's transformation of his dead sister into a goddess was not merely a private delusion, but a state-sponsored reimagining of Roman religion. Caligula commanded that Drusilla's birthday be celebrated as a public holiday, that her image be placed alongside those of the traditional Roman gods, and that citizens throughout the empire participate in rituals honoring her divine status. The cult of Drusilla became a grotesque parody of genuine religious devotion, driven not by faith, but by the emperor's inability to accept loss. Priests were forced to perform elaborate ceremonies in her honor, sacrifices were made to her divine spirit, and citizens were required to swear oaths in her name. The Roman Empire, which had conquered the world through military might and administrative efficiency, now found itself in the grip of a religion based on one man's incestuous obsession and grief-induced madness. Caligula's identification with Drusilla extended to his own self-conception. He began to claim that he was not merely her brother, but her eternal companion, destined to rule alongside her in the divine realm. This delusion manifested in increasingly erratic behavior, as the emperor would alternate between periods of manic activity, building monuments to Drusilla, expanding her cult, and punishing those who failed to show proper devotion, and episodes of catatonic depression where he would lie for days speaking only to his sister's spirit. The psychological impact of this transformation was devastating not only for Caligula, but for the entire Roman Empire. Citizens found themselves living under a regime where the emperor's personal grief had become state policy, where their religious observances were dictated by one man's inability to cope with loss, and where the very foundations of Roman civilization were being eroded by imperial madness. As Caligula's obsession with the deified Drusilla consumed his reign, the Roman Empire began to crumble under the weight of his delusions. The emperor's inability to function as a rational ruler, combined with his increasing tendency to view all political and military decisions through the lens of his relationship with his dead sister, created a crisis of governance that threatened the stability of the entire Mediterranean world. Foreign ambassadors found themselves required to pay homage to Drusilla's divine status before conducting any business with the emperor. Military commanders were forced to dedicate their victories to her memory, while senators were compelled to begin their speeches with invocations of her divine wisdom. The Roman Empire, which had prided itself on its practical approach to governance and military efficiency, was now subordinated to the whims of a madman who could not distinguish between his private grief and his public responsibilities. The emperor's behavior became increasingly unpredictable as his grief transformed into something approaching complete psychosis. He would claim to receive nocturnal visits from Drusilla's spirit, emerging from these supposed encounters with new commands and policies that often contradicted his previous decisions. The imperial court, already terrorized by Caligula's violent tendencies, now had to navigate the additional challenge of an emperor whose decision-making process was based on conversations with a dead woman. Caligula's reign of madness, built on the foundation of his obsessive love for Drusilla and his inability to accept her death, could not last indefinitely. The Roman Empire, despite its vast resources and military might, could not function under the leadership of a man who had completely lost touch with reality. The emperor's transformation of his sister into a goddess, his adoption of the role of divine widower, and his complete subordination of state policy to his personal grief created a crisis that threatened the very survival of Roman civilization. The end came, as it often does with tyrants, through conspiracy and violence. On January 24th, 41 AD, Caligula was assassinated by members of the Praetorian Guard, senators, and court officials who could no longer tolerate his reign of madness. His death brought to a close one of the most bizarre and disturbing chapters in Roman imperial history. But the legacy of his obsession with Drusilla would linger long after his blood had been washed from the palace floors. The story of Caligula and Drusilla stands as one of history's most chilling examples of how absolute power can corrupt not only political systems, but the most fundamental human relationships. Their tale is not merely one of individual madness, but of a civilization that allowed such corruption to flourish, that stood by in silence as moral boundaries were obliterated, and that paid the price for its complicity in the form of political chaos and social dissolution. In the end, Caligula's obsessive love for his sister destroyed not only himself, but countless others who were caught in the web of his delusions. The emperor, who had promised to heal the wounds of the empire, instead inflicted wounds that would take generations to heal. His transformation of sibling love into something dark and consuming, his inability to accept loss, and his complete surrender to madness serve as an eternal warning about the dangers of unchecked power and the devastating consequences of allowing personal obsessions to dictate public policy. The tragedy of Caligula and Drusilla reminds us that even in the heights of civilization, the human capacity for self-destruction remains limitless. Their story echoes through the centuries as a testament to the fragility of moral order and the terrible price that societies pay when they allow madness to masquerade as divine authority. In remembering their tale, we honor not only the victims of imperial excess, but also the enduring human need to distinguish between love and obsession, between grief and madness, between the personal and the political, distinctions that, once lost, can bring down empires and destroy the very foundations of civilized society.